The rifle hit the counter with a sound like a thunderclap, and every man in the Dustfall saloon went quiet. Rosa Harper did not look at any of them. She looked only at Arthur Finley, and her brown eyes held something that could have started a fire or ended one, depending entirely on what he said next. "Overqualified," she repeated, her voice low and precise as a surgeon's blade. "You read my letter, you invited me out to the edge of the known world, and now you are standing there telling me I am overqualified." Arthur Finley had not moved. He stood behind the bar with a rag in his hand, and the kind of expression men wore when they had said the wrong thing and knew it immediately but were too proud to retreat. He was tall, lean through the shoulders in a way that suggested hard work rather than hardship, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples from the heat. He was 31 years old, and he had not expected her. Nobody could have expected Rosa Harper. She had arrived on the noon stage from Santa Fe 3 hours earlier with a traveling trunk, a leather satchel, a Winchester rifle that she carried with the casual familiarity of a woman carrying an umbrella, and enough opinions to fill a library. She had opinions on the condition of the road. She had opinions on the quality of the water at the trough outside the livery. She had expressed, very clearly and without invitation, her opinion on the arrangement of canned goods in the general store. And now she stood in the Dustfall Saloon in Calico Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1883, and she was looking at Arthur Finley like he was the single most disappointing thing she had seen on the entire journey west. "I said," Arthur began, "I heard what you said. Miss Harper, you advertised for a cook," she said. "A cook who could manage a kitchen, plan a menu, handle supply orders, and keep a schedule." "I have been cooking professionally for 6 years. I trained under Margaret Edeline in Boston. I ran the kitchen at the Waverly Hotel for 2 years. I can make bread, roast beef, chili, custard, pickled vegetables, and a French-style soup that would make the governor of this territory cry like a child. And you are standing there telling me I am overqualified." "I'm saying," Arthur said carefully, "that a woman like you shouldn't be." "Don't." Her finger came up. "Do not finish that sentence. Do not tell me what a woman like me should or should not be doing. You do not know anything about a woman like me." The silence in the saloon had a texture to it. The 6 men occupying the tables and the single man slumped against the far wall with a beer had collectively stopped breathing. Even the piano player had lifted his hands off the keys. Arthur Finley set the rag down on the bar. That was the moment. That small, deliberate motion. It would come back to Rosa later when she tried to understand how everything began. Not the rifle on the counter. Not the argument. That single quiet act of a man putting down what he was holding so he could pay full attention. But she did not know that yet. She was still furious. "Are you going to give me the job?" she said. "Or am I going to get back on the next stage and go tell every woman between here and Albuquerque that Arthur Finley's saloon is not worth the journey?" Arthur looked at her for a long moment. "I'm going to need to understand," he said slowly, "how we ended up here. Because I placed that advertisement 4 months ago, and I would very much like to know what happened between then and now." It was, Rosa reflected later, a remarkably reasonable thing to say. She had not expected reasonable. She had built herself up for a fight, and what she got instead was a man asking a genuine question with genuine curiosity in his eyes, and that was somehow more disarming than anything else he could have done. She pulled the tall stool at the end of the bar toward her, sat down, and rested her hands on the counter. "Then sit down," she said, "and I will tell you." 4 months earlier, Rosa Harper had been standing in the kitchen of the Waverly Hotel in Boston with a letter of termination in her hand, and the very clear understanding that the world as she had built it was over. The Waverly Hotel had been sold. The new owners had brought their own staff from New York. Rosa's position, along with the positions of 11 other employees, had been eliminated with 2 weeks' notice, and a handshake that she had refused to participate in. She was 27 years old. She had spent 6 years building something real, and she had nothing to show for it except a satchel full of recipes, a set of good knives, and a reference letter that the new management had grudgingly agreed to write. Her mother had died 3 years prior. Her father had died when she was 19. She had a brother in Chicago, whom she had not spoken to in 2 years because of a disagreement she still believed she had been right about. She had no husband, no prospects in Boston that she had not already explored, and a deep, abiding restlessness that the cold, gray streets of the city had never quite managed to satisfy. It was her friend Cecilia who found the advertisement. Cecilia worked at the post office and had a habit of reading things that were not addressed to her, which Rosa had always considered a character flaw until the moment it became useful. "There is an advertisement in this newspaper from New Mexico Territory," Cecilia said, sliding the paper across the table in the small tea shop where they met every Thursday. "A saloon owner in a town called Calico Creek is looking for a professional cook. Someone who can manage a full kitchen and menu. He says he's trying to build the place into something more than a drinking establishment. He wants real food. He sounds desperate." Rosa had read the advertisement twice. It was written with more care than most. The man, Arthur Finley, the advertisement said, proprietor of the Dustfall Saloon, had clearly thought about what he was asking for. He wanted someone with real training. He wanted reliability. He wanted menus planned a week in advance. He wanted to be able to tell customers what was being served that night and have it actually be true. He offered room and board, a fair wage, and what he described as a clean and decent establishment. Rosa had spent a full night thinking about it. Boston was a closed door. The East was full of kitchens she had already worked in or been rejected from, and the ones that would take her would also underpay her and overwork her and give the credit to men who couldn't boil water without supervision. She had read enough about the territories to know they were rough and dangerous and far away from everything she understood. She had also read enough to know they were wide open, unformed, full of possibilities that the East had already used up. She wrote Arthur Finley a letter. She was very specific in the letter. She listed her qualifications, her training, her experience. She described the menu system she had developed at the Waverly. She included 2 recipes, her grandmother's red chili and her own version of a Boston brown bread that she had adapted 3 times over 5 years until it was exactly right. She said she was a woman because she had learned it was better to state things plainly than to let people be surprised, and she said she was prepared to travel if he was prepared to be a fair employer. Arthur Finley had written back within 3 weeks. His letter was shorter than hers. It said that her qualifications were exceptional, that the recipes she had sent sounded like exactly what he had in mind, and that he would be glad to have her come to Calico Creek to discuss the position. He said the job was hers if she wanted it, and if they found each other agreeable in person. She had sold most of her furniture, packed what mattered, and bought a ticket on the train to St. Louis, then another to Kansas City, then arranged stage passage south and west through the long, sun-hammered miles of the territory. It had taken her 3 weeks and had been the most uncomfortable journey of her life, and she had arrived in Calico Creek with her temper shortened by bad roads and her conviction undiminished. She had not expected him to take one look at her and say she was overqualified. She had not expected him to mean it as a warning rather than a dismissal. "A woman like you," Arthur Finley said now, sitting across the bar from her, and then he stopped and started again. "I don't mean it the way it sounded. I mean, look at this place." She looked. She had looked when she walked in. The Dustfall Saloon was a wide, low-ceilinged room with plank floors that had been swept clean, 6 round tables, a bar that ran the length of the south wall, and a staircase to the rooms above. It was not elegant, but it was not the disaster she had half expected either. Someone had put effort into the place. There were curtains in the windows. The bar was polished. The glasses were lined up evenly. What it lacked was a kitchen. She had noticed immediately. Through the door behind the bar there was a back room with a cast-iron stove, a table, 2 shelves, and enough space for one person to work if they did not mind working in conditions that she would have described charitably as frontier. I see it, she said. I started this saloon 4 years ago, Arthur said. It was a 2-room shack when I bought it. I built the bar myself. I put in the floors myself. I've been serving whiskey and whatever I can manage on that stove, mostly beans, mostly badly, and I've been thinking for 2 years about what this place could become. I wrote that advertisement because I had a vision of something. A real dining room, real food. Something that would bring families in, not just men with whiskey money. He paused, but I put it together in my head as just a cook, someone to run the kitchen. I didn't think about who might answer. And now you're looking at me, Rosa said, and you're thinking I'm going to walk in, fix everything, and then leave. The expression on his face told her she was right. You trained in Boston, he said. You ran a hotel kitchen. You're capable of something a lot better than Calico Creek. Rosa was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved down the main street and rattled the sign above the door. Somewhere down the road, a horse complained about something. The men at the tables had quietly resumed their card games and their drinking, pretending with great effort that they were not listening to every word. I am going to tell you something, Mr. Finley, she said, and I want you to hear it carefully. I'm listening. I have spent 6 years being capable in places where capable women are managed, minimized, and eventually replaced by men who are not as capable. I have cooked meals that people talked about for weeks, and the praise went to the hotel owner who had never touched a kitchen in his life. I have designed menus, trained staff, managed supply orders, and solved problems that nobody even knew were problems, and I have done all of it while being paid less than men who did less than half the work. She let that settle. I did not come to Calico Creek because I couldn't do better. I came because I think you might actually let me. Arthur Finley looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up the rag he had set down, looked at it like he had forgotten it was in his hand, and put it behind the bar. The kitchen is small, he said. I've seen it. The stove is a Majestic Range 1878 model. It runs hot on the left side. I've worked on worse. The closest supply source with any real variety is 40 miles. Stage comes twice a week. Then I'll need to plan menus 2 weeks in advance and be very creative with what's local. The men who drink here, he said carefully, are not all of the highest character. I've worked in a hotel, she said. I have met every character there is. Something shifted in his face. It was very slight, a loosening around the jaw, the faintest suggestion of a smile in the corners of his eyes. He was not a man who smiled easily, she sensed, but he was not a man who was cruel about it. The job pays $8 a week, he said. Room and board included. Room is upstairs, second door on the left. It's clean. $10, she said. He blinked. You advertised for someone with exceptional qualifications, she said. You found them, $10. There was a pause that lasted exactly 4 seconds. 9, he said. $9.50. Another pause. Fine, he said. Rosa Harper picked up her Winchester from the counter, rested it against her shoulder with the easy familiarity that had clearly unsettled several of the men watching, and held out her free hand. Arthur Finley shook it. His hand was warm and rough and strong, and the handshake lasted 2 seconds longer than was strictly necessary. She noticed. She chose not to think about it. The kitchen, she discovered the next morning, was worse than she had assessed the evening before. Not in terms of cleanliness. Arthur had kept it reasonably clean, which surprised her and revised her opinion of him slightly upward. But in terms of equipment and space, it was the kind of kitchen that would have made her old mentor Margaret Edeline place her hand over her heart and sit down. There was the Majestic Range, which did indeed run hot on the left and had a temper that needed learning. There was a workbench, a single shelf of dry goods, a small cold box that was nowhere near cold enough in the New Mexico heat, and approximately 6 square feet of working space. There were pots and pans in a state she would not have described as acceptable, and a set of knives that she replaced within the first hour by unpacking her own. There was also, she discovered, a door at the back of the kitchen that opened onto a small dirt yard with a well, an ash heap, and what appeared to be the remains of a kitchen garden that had given up somewhere around the previous spring. She stood in the yard with her hands on her hips and stared at the dead garden for a long time. Then she went back inside and made breakfast. She made cornbread from the recipe she had been refining since she was 12 years old, working in her mother's kitchen in New Haven. She made a pot of coffee that she adjusted 3 times until it was right. She scrambled eggs with a little dried pepper and a trick her grandmother had taught her. She set it all out on the bar, because there was no dining room yet, and she announced it simply to the 3 men who were already present at 7 in the morning, nursing whatever they had been nursing since the night before. Arthur came downstairs at 7:30 with his boots in his hand and stopped at the bottom of the stairs. The smell hit him first. She watched his face. That's he started. "Breakfast," she said. "I'm going to need a list from you today of every supplier you currently use, every contact you have in the area, and your average weekly customer count. I'm also going to need lumber." He sat down at the bar, pulled on his boot, and looked at the food in front of him. "Lumber. For shelving. The cold storage situation is not adequate. I need more working space in the kitchen, and I have an idea about the backyard that I want to discuss." He pulled on the other boot and picked up the fork she had laid out. He took one bite of the cornbread. He was quiet for a moment. "The backyard," he said. "The kitchen garden. It can be revived. I know what grows in this climate. If I can get it working by spring, we'll have fresh herbs, peppers, tomatoes in season, squash. It will cut supply costs and improve the food significantly." Arthur chewed slowly, thoughtfully. He took a sip of the coffee. His expression went through several variations of something she could not quite name. "It's been a while," he said, "since someone cooked a proper breakfast in this kitchen." "Has anyone ever cooked a proper breakfast in this kitchen?" He considered this. "No," he said honestly. "Then it hasn't been a while," she said. "It's been never, which means you have nothing to compare it to, and you're just going to have to trust me." He looked at her over the coffee cup, and there was that almost smile again. She went back into the kitchen before it could develop into something she had to make a decision about. The first week was a negotiation conducted entirely in the language of food, space, and logistics. Rosa reorganized the kitchen in the first 2 days, a process that required Arthur's cooperation in the form of moving the workbench 6 inches to the left and agreeing to her request for lumber, which arrived via the town's carpenter, a quiet man named Hector Vasquez, who listened to Rosa's specifications without comment and produced exactly what she asked for in 48 hours. She told him his work was excellent. He looked at his boots and said, "Thank you, ma'am," and she made him a plate of the chili from her grandmother's recipe when it was ready, and after that he became her most devoted supporter in Calico Creek. By the 3rd day she had a menu. It was simple. It had to be simple given the supplies available, but it was real. Beans done properly, slow-cooked with dried chili and onion, with cornbread on the side. A rotating meat option depending on what was available, because the butcher in town was a rancher named Silas Ackerman who kept somewhat unpredictable stock. A soup each day. Pie on Sundays. She put the menu on a board at the front of the saloon and watched what happened. What happened was that by the end of the first week, the Dustfall Saloon was serving twice as many dinners as it had the previous month. It was not the food alone, though the food was good and people noticed immediately. It was the fact of a menu. The fact that a person could walk in and know what they were going to eat before they sat down. The fact that the food came out consistent, hot, and tasted like something made with intention rather than desperation. Arthur did not comment on the numbers directly. He was not a man who spoke easily about things that moved him. But she noticed that he stayed in the kitchen longer than he needed to on the evenings when the room was full, moving between the bar and the back room on various pretexts that became increasingly transparent. She chose not to comment on this. On the 6th day, she went looking for him mid-morning and found him outside behind the saloon, crouched in the dirt yard examining the dead kitchen garden with what appeared to be genuine concentration. He heard her footsteps and looked up. He had a handful of dry soil in his palm, and he was frowning at it in a way she associated with people confronting a problem they did not yet have language for. "The soil is poor," he said. "I know. It needs compost. I've been collecting ash and kitchen scraps in that bin." She pointed to the wooden box she had set against the fence. "Give it until spring and it'll be workable. You really know how to do that, grow things." "My mother grew things, my grandmother before her. Every woman in my family grew things because if you don't grow it, you might not eat it, and that has been true right up until about 30 years ago in polite society." She paused. "It's still true in most places." Arthur looked at the soil in his hand for a moment, then let it run through his fingers. He stood up, brushing his palm against his trousers, and looked at her with that direct, clear gaze that she was beginning to recognize as his default mode. He was not a man who looked away from things. "Where did you learn to shoot?" he said. It was not what she had expected. She blinked. "My father, he was from Virginia. He believed that women should be able to manage a household, a rifle, and an argument in equal measure. He sounds like an unusual man." He was. "He died when I was 19. I've been managing the rifle and the argument on my own since then." Something moved through Arthur's face. Not pity, she would have stepped back from pity immediately, but something more careful than that. Acknowledgement, recognition of a fact without trying to fix it. "The Brannigan brothers were in last night," he said, changing the subject with a smoothness she appreciated. "They'll come back, they always do. I want you to know that I'm aware they can be difficult. The large men who told me the beans were, and I am quoting directly, the best thing they'd eaten since their mother died. Yes, they were fine. They will become less fine," he said carefully, "if they drink enough, which they will because that is what the Brannigan brothers do." Rosa looked at him. "Are you worried about me, Mr. Finley?" "It's my establishment," he said. "I worry about everyone who works here." "How many people work here?" "You and me," he said after a pause. She understood then that this was a more complicated admission than it sounded. He had been running the dustfall entirely alone. Bar, cooking, management, supplies, repairs, all of it one person for 4 years. "Then," she said, "I imagine you've been very worried about yourself for a long time." He opened his mouth, closed it, and then said nothing. She went back inside to start the soup. The Brannigan brothers were, as predicted, less fine on Saturday night. There were 3 of them: Cal, who was the oldest and the loudest; Dewey, who was large and quiet, and did what Cal said; and Pete, who was 23 and trying very hard to seem more dangerous than he was. They came in at 8, already several drinks into their evening from wherever they had started it, and they took up the largest table with the kind of deliberate sprawl that was meant to communicate territorial ownership. Rosa was bringing out the last of the dinner plates, a late order from a family she had not expected. A husband and wife with 2 children who had heard about the food and come down from the small farm they were working north of town. She had made the children smaller portions, charged the parents accordingly, and been more pleased about it than she probably should have been, because it confirmed something about what the dustfall could become. She was setting a plate in front of the younger child when Cal Brannigan said something loud and deliberately offensive about women in saloons that she was not going to repeat, even in her own mind. The room went quiet in that specific way. Rosa finished placing the plate. She straightened. She turned around. "I appreciate," she said, in the same voice she used when she explained kitchen procedures to new staff, clear and calm and carrying absolutely no uncertainty, "that you gentlemen have had a long week. I've been told you work hard, and I believe it. But there is a family eating dinner over here, and I am going to ask you to keep your thoughts to yourself until they are finished." Cal Brannigan stared at her. "I am also going to tell you," she continued, "that I have a plate of that chili you liked set aside with your name on it, and whether you get it depends entirely on the next 10 seconds. There was a long pause. Cal Brannigan looked at her. Then he looked at Dewey. Then he looked at Pete. Then he picked up his beer and took a drink, and the room exhaled. Rosa went back into the kitchen. She was aware, without turning around, that Arthur Finley had been standing at the end of the bar with his hand under the counter where she knew he kept a wooden club. She was also aware that he had not needed to use it. She chose not to comment on this either. He came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, ostensibly to get water. "You handled that well," he said. "I know. You didn't need to offer him the chili." "Of course I needed to offer him the chili," she said, not looking up from the pot she was cleaning. "You don't diffuse a situation by taking things away. You diffuse it by giving people something better to do than be angry. That's true in a kitchen and it's true everywhere else." Arthur was quiet for a moment. She heard him set his water glass down. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "Experience," she said, "and paying attention. Most people with experience and attention don't end up in Calico Creek." She looked up at him then. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and his expression was the most open she had seen it, genuinely curious, genuinely present, with all the careful distance he usually maintained, just slightly relaxed. "I told you," she said. "I came because I thought you might actually let me do the work. I haven't tried to stop you yet." "No," she said, "you haven't." The moment held for 3 full seconds before she went back to the pot. The weeks passed and the dustfall changed. It changed in ways that were visible and ways that were not. The visible changes, Rosa's shelving, which gave the back room an actual organization. The kitchen garden, which she turned the soil of every dry afternoon, working in the compost she was building, adding seeds she had ordered through the general store from a catalog, covering the beds with old cloth on the nights when the temperature dropped. The menu board at the front, updated every Sunday night for the coming week. The dining room tables, which Rosa had rearranged and which she had strongly suggested, then eventually insisted, needed proper tablecloths, a battle she won by showing Arthur the numbers. Families with money spent more than single men with whiskey, and families with money required tablecloths. The tablecloths arrived from Santa Fe 3 weeks after she asked for them. Arthur put them on the tables himself, on a Monday morning when the saloon was quiet, and Rosa watched him from the kitchen doorway, smoothing the corners with his large, careful hands, and she felt something in her chest that she decided to classify as professional satisfaction and move on from immediately. The invisible changes were more complex. She and Arthur had fallen into a rhythm that had the quality of something long established, which was strange because she had been there less than a month. They talked in the mornings over coffee. She had fixed the coffee situation on day 2, and it remained fixed about the day's plans, the supply list, what needed doing. They talked in the evenings after the last customers left, sometimes sitting at the bar with their own cups of coffee or the occasional glass of the better whiskey Arthur kept on the high shelf, about larger things. Plans for the saloon, the state of Calico Creek, which was a town of 200 and change with ambitions toward becoming more. The nature of the territory, which Arthur knew in detail from 4 years of living in it, and which Rosa approached with the focused curiosity she applied to everything new. He told her about the history of the town, which had grown up around a silver strike in 1873 and was now shifting toward agriculture and ranching as the silver ran thin. He told her about the people who was trustworthy, who wasn't, where the tensions ran between the Anglo settlers and the Mexican families who had been there for generations before any of them arrived, and between those families and the Apache bands who moved through the territory and had been doing so since long before anyone living could remember. She listened carefully to all of it, and she asked questions that he had clearly not expected, not the obvious questions, but the ones underneath them. Who held the actual power in Calico Creek, and what were they doing with it? What did people actually need versus what did they think they needed? What was the thing nobody talked about that everybody knew? "You think like a strategist," he said one evening. "I think like someone who has had to navigate spaces that were not built for her," she said. "That teaches you to read a room." Arthur looked at her across the bar. The lanterns were turned low, the saloon was empty, and outside the October wind was finding every gap in the plank walls. She had added dried chili peppers and a braid of garlic to the kitchen shelf, and the smell of the place was entirely different from what it had been a month ago. Richer, more inhabited, "Why haven't you asked me about my dark past?" he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Do you have one?" "Everyone in the territories has one. It's more or less required." "I assumed you would tell me what I needed to know when it was relevant," she said. "I don't make a habit of digging for information that isn't offered." He was quiet for a moment. "I was a Pinkerton man," he said. "From 1873 to 1879. 6 years." She did not react immediately because the Pinkertons were a complicated subject and she had opinions that she was deciding whether to share. "I did things," he said carefully, "in service of that work that I would not do again. I was involved in actions against labor organizers in '75 that I am not. I was following orders, and that is the least satisfying excuse a man can make. I left in 1879. I came to New Mexico because it was far enough that the things I was trying to leave behind had a fighting chance of staying behind. And," she said, "and I built this place. And it has been the first thing in my life that I built with my own hands and my own money and my own choices. No one telling me what to do, no organization, no mission." He paused. "No bodies." The last 2 words were quiet and sat heavily in the air. "Do you feel you've made amends?" She said, "No, I don't think amends is the right shape. I think the right shape is just doing something real, for as long as I can." He looked at the bar surface. "This is probably not what you were expecting to hear. I have a folder in my head labeled things that are not what I expected, and it has been filling up since I arrived in Calico Creek," she said. "You're in it." He looked at her. "Is that a criticism?" "No," she said. "It is not." That was the night she stopped classifying the feeling in her chest as professional satisfaction. November arrived with cold that came hard and fast off the mountains to the north, and the kitchen became the warmest room in the building, which meant that more of the Dustfalls business happened in and around the kitchen without anyone formally deciding it should. Arthur's stool migrated from its position at the end of the bar to the doorway between the kitchen and the main room, where he sat in the evenings and they talked while she worked. The Dustfall had become, by November, a dining establishment, in fact, if not yet in official designation. Word had spread in the way that word spreads in small territories, person to person, over distances, carried on the stage and in conversation at the general store and the livery and the Sunday services at the small Methodist church on the south end of town. People came for the food. They stayed for the whiskey. They came back. Rosa had been right about the families with money. 3 ranch families were now regular Sunday dinner customers, making the drive into town specifically for the meal. The pastor's wife had asked for the cornbread recipe, which Rosa declined to share but offered instead to teach, which was better. She had begun giving cooking lessons on Tuesday mornings to 3 women from town who had asked, and she charged for them, which some people thought was bold and which Rosa thought was entirely reasonable. She was building something. She felt it under her hands every day, the way she had always felt the best work, not as a performance for anyone else's benefit but as a construction, solid and real and entirely her own. The complication was Arthur Finley. She had not come to Calico Creek for a man. She had been deliberate about this, running through it carefully in her mind during the long stage journey west. She was 27. She had no particular objection to the idea of a husband someday, but she had seen enough women surrender themselves to marriage before they had finished becoming who they were, and she had no intention of doing that. She had work to do. She had things to build. Arthur Finley was, in her own honest accounting, making this resolution more complicated with every passing week. He was not doing anything wrong. He was not pursuing her. He was not being inappropriate. He was, in fact, being so carefully appropriate that she sometimes wanted to throw something at him, which told her more about her own feelings than she was entirely comfortable with. He held doors. He made sure the heavy supply boxes were moved before she asked. He fixed the stove's hot left problem in November, spending 2 days on it with tools she hadn't known he had. And when she tested it and found it even, she had looked at him and he had looked back with that almost smile and she had very deliberately turned away. There was, she kept reminding herself, the practical matter of their situation. She was his employee. He was her employer. These things required a particular care that she had every intention of maintaining. She was very successfully maintaining it on the Wednesday afternoon in mid-November when she went out to the cold box to retrieve the butter she needed and found, hanging from the latch in the freezing afternoon air, a single dried red chili and a small folded piece of paper. She unfolded the paper. On it, in handwriting she recognized as Arthur's, was a message that said, "Your kitchen garden will make it through the winter." I've been reading about New Mexico soil composition. The ash content in this yard is actually ideal. I thought you should know. She stood outside in the cold with the note in her hand for longer than was strictly efficient. Then she went back into the kitchen and started on the butter. When Arthur came through the kitchen that evening, she said without preamble, "Thank you for the note." He said, without looking up from what he was carrying, seemed useful information. "It was," she said. "Good," he said. Neither of them mentioned the dried chili that she had hung on the beam above the stove beside the garlic. The trouble came in December, and it came in the form of a man named Warren Coles. Warren Coles was the owner of the other establishment in Calico Creek that served food, a rough roadhouse at the north end of the main street that had operated, until Rosa's arrival, as the only place in town where a working man could get a meal that wasn't cooked at home. It served bad food badly and was proud of it. Warren Coles was a large, slow-moving man with a grievance collection that he maintained with great dedication, and the success of the Dustfall Saloon's kitchen had become one of the newest entries. He came into the Dustfall on a Thursday afternoon when Arthur was out at the livery, and Rosa was alone in the kitchen. She heard the door and came out into the bar, wiping her hands on her apron, and found Warren Coles standing in the middle of the room with the specific posture of a man who has planned what he is going to say. "You're the cook," he said. "I am," she said. "I've got a business interest in this town," he said. "A long-standing one. I've been here since '75. I don't appreciate what you've done to my customers." "I haven't done anything to your customers," she said calmly. "If they're choosing to eat here instead of there, that's a choice they're making freely. They're making it because you're putting on airs, tablecloths and menus and all of it. You're making people think they need something they never needed before. I think," Rosa said, keeping her voice even, "that what I'm actually doing is providing good food at a fair price, which has always been an option available to anyone who wanted to offer it." Warren Coles's face darkened. "You're a woman running a kitchen in a saloon. That's not proper. The propriety of my employment," she said, "is between me and Mr. Finley." "Finley," he said, and the name came out with a complicated contempt that told her there was history there, "has been overreaching since he planted himself in this town. And now he's importing—" "Careful," she said softly. He stopped. She moved nothing. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him with the same steady calm she used in every difficult situation, and she said, "I would encourage you to finish that sentence very carefully, Mr. Coles." He looked at her for a long moment, recalibrated something, and said, "This isn't over," which was a less satisfying exit line than he had probably been aiming for. He left. Rosa went back into the kitchen, put water on for coffee, and stood at the stove with her hands on the counter, breathing slowly. The confrontation had not frightened her. She had been in enough of them to know how they worked, and she had read Warren Coles accurately enough to know he was bluster before substance. But the history between him and Arthur was a thing she needed to understand. Arthur was back within the hour. She told him about the visit with the same precision she brought to a supply list. His expression went through several variations quickly: concern, anger, something she might have called protectiveness, and then a careful settling. He sat down on the stool in the kitchen doorway. "Warren Coles and I have a history," he said. "I gathered that. He made a claim on this building in 1880. Said the original owner owed him money and the building was collateral. I had bought the building legally in 1879 from the original owner, who had no debt to Coles as far as anyone could establish. But Coles," he paused. He has a particular skill for making legal things complicated. He brought a lawyer from Santa Fe. It cost me more than I had to prove what I already knew. He lost, and he has not forgiven it. So this is about the building, she said. At the bottom of it, yes. And at the top of it, Arthur looked at her steadily. At the top of it, he doesn't like that this place is succeeding. And he is the kind of man who responds to other people's success by looking for hidden vulnerabilities. He mentioned impropriety, she said, keeping her tone entirely neutral. I know. Will that be a problem? Arthur was quiet for a moment, and when he looked at her, his expression was something she had not seen from him before, direct and deliberate and very careful all at once. It will only be a problem, he said, if I give him something real to point at, which I intend not to do. It took her a moment to understand what he was saying. When she did, she felt something in her chest that was equal parts warmth and something that ached in a way she didn't have immediate words for. He was being careful, he was being protective, and he was doing it entirely on her behalf, not his own. Mr. Finley, she said, you've been very careful with me since I arrived. I've tried to be. Is that going to be a permanent arrangement? He looked at her. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the soup she had on the stove and the dried herbs and the wood smoke and the specific combination of things that the dustfall had become in the 2 months since her arrival. The winter light was going outside and the lantern on the shelf was casting everything in amber. I don't know, he said honestly. What would you like it to be? Rosa considered this for a moment. I think, she said, that we could start with you calling me Rosa. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. Rosa, he said, not testing it, receiving it, like something he had been given. Arthur, she said. The soup needed attention. She attended to it. But the name stayed in the kitchen air between them like a change in weather, and neither of them pretended it didn't. Winter deepened and the dustfall became a different kind of place entirely. The dining room, they had started calling the main room the dining room, which was a small but significant shift, was full most evenings now, and on Sundays it reached a capacity that Rosa was already planning expansions to accommodate. She had talked to Hector Vasquez about a side room addition, sketching dimensions on paper, working out what the cost would be and how long the build would take. Arthur had looked at her sketches for a long time in silence before agreeing, and she had known from the way he traced the drawing with his finger that he was seeing something he had imagined for a long time in a form he hadn't quite known how to reach. She was seeing it too, not just the building, the thing the building contained. A real establishment, a place people came to because they wanted to, because it was good, because it meant something. And she was seeing Arthur. This was the part she had not planned for, and could not quite account for in her usually reliable system of rational navigation. She had catalogued the surface things early. He was physically striking in a way that was particular to men who worked outdoors with their bodies, lean and solid and brown from the sun, with those dark eyes that saw things clearly and the hands that were both strong and careful in a way she found disproportionately compelling. She had noted these things, filed them under irrelevant, and moved on. What she had not fully reckoned with was everything underneath the surface. The way he listened. Not politely, actually. When she spoke, he heard what she was saying, and he thought about it before he responded, and his responses engaged with the actual content rather than the performance of engagement. She had not realized before Arthur how rare that was. She had thought it was ordinary. The way he moved through his own world with the quiet ownership of a man who had built something and knew what it had cost. He was not proud in a way that required an audience. He was simply settled in himself, and that settledness had a gravity she had been trying to resist since approximately the 3rd week. The dark past she had thought about more than once. The Pinkerton years. The things he had done that he would not do again. She was not naive enough to think that a man could spend 6 years as an operative for an organization with the Pinkertons' history and come out of it clean. She had not asked for more details, and he had not offered them. What she had decided, over the long, slow process of the autumn and early winter, was that what mattered was the man in front of her. Not the history she hadn't witnessed, but the evidence she was accumulating every day. A man who built things with his hands, who told the truth even when the truth was hard, who had put down the rag so he could pay full attention, who left notes on the cold box about soil composition. She was falling in love with Arthur Finley, and she had been for some time, and she was no longer pretending otherwise. The question was what to do about it, because the complications were real. He was still her employer. They still lived in the same building. And there was Warren Coles looking for vulnerabilities, which meant that anything between them that was not managed carefully could become a weapon. She was thinking about all of this on a cold December afternoon when she walked out to the kitchen garden to check the covers she'd laid over the winter beds, and found Arthur already there, crouching beside the beds exactly as he had been in October, but this time with purpose instead of curiosity. He had added a layer of straw along the edges of the cloth covers, and was pressing it down carefully against the cold ground. She stopped in the doorway. He heard her and looked up. The afternoon was gray, and the cold was serious, and his breath made small clouds in the air. He looked for a moment exactly like what he was, a man doing a small, careful, entirely voluntary thing to protect something that mattered to someone he cared about. "It should help," he said. "The straw insulates against the frost." "I know," she said. "I read about it. You've been doing a lot of reading." "You've been worth reading for," he said. The words were simple and the tone was steady, and she understood, precisely and immediately, that this was Arthur Finley saying something as plainly as he knew how. This man who was careful with words, who processed before he spoke, who had been circling something for 2 months with all the patience of someone who had learned to measure the cost of a wrong move, was saying it plainly. Rosa stepped down into the yard. She closed the distance between them in 4 steps, and she looked at him at close range, this careful, complicated, surprisingly kind man, and she said, "Then I should tell you that I have also been reading." "Have you?" he said. Not a question. "The evidence," she said, "has been accumulating since approximately the 3rd week." He stood up slowly. They were close enough that she could see the specific quality of the way he was looking at her, which was open in a way he was not usually open, every layer of careful removed. "Rosa," he said. "Yes," she said, because she understood it was the beginning of a question she already knew the answer to. He kissed her in the kitchen garden in the cold December afternoon, both of them standing over the winter beds she was determined to grow into something, and it was nothing like tentative. It was a kiss that had 2 months of careful restraint behind it, warm and honest and thorough. And when it was over, she kept her hands on his lapels because the alternative was using them to steady herself. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. He was not smiling exactly, but his face was doing something she would learn to call joy, which in Arthur's economy of expression was more than most men gave in a full declaration. "We are going to have to navigate this carefully," she said, "because of Coles." "I know. And the situation with us being, I know," he said again. His hands were at her waist, warm through the wool of her coat. "I've thought about it. And the careful navigation includes," he said, "my having a conversation with you about something I've been thinking about since October." She waited. "I want to make you a partner," he said. "In the Dustfall, not an employee, an owner. Half the business, your name on the establishment." She stared at him. "You've tripled the food revenue in 2 months," he said with the practicality of a man who had been building to something. "The dining room expansion is your idea. The kitchen garden is your project. The Tuesday lessons are yours. The reputation that's bringing families out from the ranches, that's because of you. You should own what you've built." "Arthur," she said. "It also," he said, "makes the Coles situation considerably cleaner. A woman who is a proprietor of the establishment she works in is a different legal and social position than a woman who is an employee. You've been planning this since October." "Since the 3rd week," he said, meeting her eyes steadily. "When I understood that you were going to build something I'd been trying to build for 4 years in about 4 months, and that I very much wanted you to stay." Rosa looked at him for a long moment. The cold air was moving around them, and the straw he'd laid along the garden beds was golden against the gray ground, and somewhere above them, a hawk was making slow circles in the sky. "That," she said, "is probably the most romantic thing anyone has said to me, and it is also a business proposition." "Both things can be true," he said. She laughed. She felt it come up from somewhere genuine, a real and surprised laugh, and she felt him respond to it, a loosening in his whole body, like the laugh had done something good. "Yes," she said, "both things can be true." They drew up the partnership agreement with the help of the town's lawyer, a sober and efficient man named David Carmichael, who handled the paperwork without comment and recorded it with the territorial office in Santa Fe. The Dustfall Saloon and Dining Room became, in January of 1884, jointly owned by Arthur Finley and Rosa Harper, which fact was posted on the door beside the menu board. Warren Coles read it, according to the general store owner who saw him twice. He did not come into the Dustfall after that. His roadhouse continued to operate, because Calico Creek was large enough to support 2 establishments, and because Rosa had no interest in running him out of business, only in running her own better. The hidden motive she had always suspected in his behavior never materialized into anything more than resentment, and resentment, without a target to focus it, eventually dispersed into the usual background noise of small-town grievance. January was cold and busy, and full of the kind of days that Rosa would remember for years. The side room addition went up with Hector Vasquez's crew and was finished by the end of the month, which gave the Dustfall's dining room a capacity of 40 people and a small private corner that became immediately popular for family dinners and celebrations. Rosa expanded the menu for the larger space, adding a second nightly option, and ordered supplies on a system she refined into something that barely wasted $1. She and Arthur moved through their days in a partnership that had the quality of something that had always been there waiting for them. They worked side by side in the comfortable overlap of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms. He kept the bar, managed the floor, handled the business accounts. She ran the kitchen, managed the supply chain, designed the menus, and continued the Tuesday cooking lessons, which had expanded to 8 regular students. They talked constantly about work and plans and the 1,000 details of running an establishment together, and they talked about other things, the larger things, over coffee in the mornings and the good whiskey at night. He told her more of the Pinkerton years, not all of it, but enough. She listened with the careful attention she brought to everything. She did not offer absolution, because that was not hers to give and he had not asked for it. She said only that she thought the shape he had described doing something real, for as long as possible, was the right shape, and she meant it. She told him things she had not told many people. The loneliness of the years after her mother died. The specific exhaustion of being capable in a world that valued capability in women only up to the point where it became inconvenient. The brother in Chicago she had not spoken to, and the substance of the disagreement which had been about her choosing her career over coming home to manage the household in the aftermath of grief, and which she had been right about and felt guilty about in equal measure. "Write to him," Arthur said one evening. "It's been 2 years. And a day doesn't matter," he said. "People want to be reached, even when they're proud." She wrote the letter the next morning. The response, when it came 6 weeks later, was shorter than she would have liked but warmer than she had expected. The correspondence continued. By spring the distance between her and her brother Thomas had not fully closed, but it had reduced to something workable, something that had the possibility of more. "Thank you," she said to Arthur the morning the spring letter arrived. "You did the hard part," he said. "I just said the obvious thing." "Most people don't say the obvious thing," she said. "They think it too uncomfortable." He handed her the coffee, their hands touching in the transfer, a deliberate small moment that had become part of their morning. "Then most people," he said, "are cowards about the things that matter." The kitchen garden came alive in spring. She had been tending it all winter with the disciplined faith of someone who understood both soil and time, and when the first green appeared in March, she felt a disproportionate happiness that she expressed by going immediately to find Arthur and pulling him out the back door to look at it. He stood in the cold spring morning looking at the tiny green shoots with an expression she had come to love, the specific quality of a man looking at evidence of something he had believed in being proved right. By May, the garden was producing herbs and early greens. By July, it had tomatoes, chili peppers in several varieties, squash and beans that Rosa processed and stored with the organizational intensity she applied to everything. The kitchen cost of fresh produce dropped significantly. The quality of the food improved in ways she hadn't even fully anticipated, because there was something about fresh-grown ingredients in the summer heat that could not be replicated by anything that had traveled 40 miles in a supply box. The Dustfall saloon and dining room had become, by the summer of 1884, the kind of establishment that people in a 50-mile radius spoke about with warmth and specificity. Not as an abstraction, but as a particular place, with particular food, run by particular people. This specificity, the thing Rosa had always believed was the difference between a place people visited and a place people valued, was what she had been building toward since the moment she set the menu board in the window. She was, she understood, as happy as she had been in her adult life. There was still the matter of what she and Arthur were to each other, which they had not formally resolved beyond the partnership and the kiss in the garden, and the morning coffee, and the evening conversations, and the growing accumulation of small daily tenderness that neither of them named directly. She had come to understand that Arthur processed things slowly and deliberately, not because he was uncertain, but because he had learned that careful construction was worth more than quick assembly. She was not an impatient woman by nature, though she had strong opinions about timeliness. She trusted the process. In August, he asked her to take a walk with him, which was unusual enough. Arthur did not make social propositions mid-workday, that she untied her apron without hesitation. He took her east of town, along the road toward the low hills where the desert opened up into something vast and indifferent and beautiful, and they walked for a half-mile in the late afternoon heat before he stopped and turned to face her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. "And I want to preface it," he said, with the careful precision he brought to important things, "by saying that I am aware that what we have is already. I know that what we are already has value, and I am not asking because I think anything is incomplete. I'm asking because I believe it would be better with the question answered." She waited. "Rosa Harper," he said, "will you marry me?" The desert light was the specific amber of late August, and the hawks she had come to associate with the territory were moving in the high air above the hills, and the man in front of her had dark eyes that held absolutely nothing back, and she had a recipe for cornbread that had come from her grandmother, and a rifle that had come from her father, and enough opinions on enough subjects to last several lifetimes. She had come to the edge of the known world looking for a place that would let her do the work. She had found something she had not known to look for. "Yes," she said, "obviously yes." The almost smile broke into the real thing, and she understood in that moment that she had been working toward this expression of his for 9 months without fully knowing it, this open, unguarded, entirely present smile that transformed his face and was clearly extremely rare and was directed entirely at her. She kissed him in the desert light, and it was nothing like the December garden. It was unhurried and certain and warm all the way through. They were married in October, 1 year after Rosa's arrival in Calico Creek, by Pastor Michael Hands at the Methodist Church on the south end of town. The ceremony was attended by more people than the church could comfortably hold, because the Dustfalls dining room had become a community fixture, and Rosa had inadvertently become a community figure through the cooking lessons and the garden, and the simple fact of being exactly who she was in a place that had not previously had anyone like her. Hector Vasquez came, with his wife Alina and their 3 children, and he shook Arthur's hand with the serious formality of a man paying respect to something earned. The 3 ranch families who were Sunday regulars came, and 2 of the women had brought gifts that were practical and specific: good knives, a preserving set, a bolt of kitchen cloth, because they knew Rosa well enough to know what she valued. The Brannigan brothers came and sat in the back row with their hats in their hands and their faces arranged in expressions of concentrated solemnity, which was the most moving thing Rosa had seen in months. The pastor's wife had made the cake, using the recipe Rosa had finally agreed to share as a wedding gift, and it was a version of the Boston brown bread made sweet with molasses and served in layers, and it was excellent, which Rosa said sincerely and felt sincerely. At the reception, which was held in the Dust Falls expanded dining room with the tablecloths and the candles and enough food to warrant an account of it for years, Arthur made a toast that was 3 sentences long. I placed an advertisement for a cook. I got a partner, a gardener, a strategist, and the best argument I've ever lost. I am the luckiest man in the New Mexico territory. Rosa did not make a speech. She did not need to. She stood beside Arthur Finley with her hand in his and looked at the room full of people eating the food she had made in a place she had built, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who had found the exact shape of the life she had been moving toward. The winter of 1884 was milder than the previous one, which Rosa took as a favorable opinion from the territory on recent events. The kitchen garden went dormant under its straw blanket. Tended by Arthur on the mornings, she was occupied with the increased December business, and she had preserved enough of the summer's production to last through spring in a way that made the supply costs for the cold months considerably more manageable. They had converted the second-floor rooms. There were 4, and Rosa had been living in the one closest to the stairs, while Arthur occupied the one at the end of the hall, into a single combined living space, which required Hector Vasquez's team for a week and resulted in something that was genuinely comfortable by the standards of the territory and considerably better than what either of them had been managing separately. Rosa had opinions about the arrangement of the furniture, which Arthur listened to, and Arthur had opinions about the placement of the stove insert that she agreed was actually better. The results were very good. They were very good together, which she had understood abstractly from early on and which she understood in full now, in the daily lived reality of a shared life. He remained the man who paid complete attention, who processed before he spoke, who built things carefully with his hands. She remained the woman who arrived with opinions on everything and a recipe for every occasion, and the Winchester, which she kept cleaned and ready on the bracket above the door of their rooms, because this was still the New Mexico territory, and some things were constant. He had learned over the course of the year to find her opinions something other than daunting. She had learned over the same period that some arguments were worth making, and some were worth letting him figure out on his own, which was a distinction she had not previously appreciated. In March of 1885, Rosa understood that the Dust Fall was going to have more than 2 proprietors. She told Arthur on a Wednesday morning, standing in the kitchen with the coffee she had just made. In the same direct and practical way, she told him everything, and watched his face do something she would remember for the rest of her life. He was very still for exactly 4 seconds, and then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her with the kind of care a man takes with something he is afraid of damaging, and she stood in the warm kitchen and felt him breathe and said, "It's all right. I'm fine. We're going to be fine." "I know," he said into her hair. He stopped. "I know," she said. She had continued to run the kitchen through the spring and summer, adapting her work as the months passed, and handing more of the direct cooking to the 2 kitchen assistants she had finally hired. A young Mexican woman named Consuelo Reyes, who had been coming to Tuesday lessons since January and had a genuine talent, and a ranch hand turned aspiring cook named Billy Marsh, who was less naturally gifted but was reliable and listened, which she valued as much as talent. She trained them both in her methods with the same precision and generosity she brought to everything, and by summer the kitchen was running in a way she could step back from on the heavy days without the food quality suffering, which was what she had been building toward. In November of 1885, their son was born. Arthur James Finley, named in the order that satisfied both of their family's traditions, arrived at what the doctor described as a reasonable hour on a Thursday morning in the room above the dustfall, which Rosa had prepared with the same organizational precision she applied to kitchen management. He was healthy and substantial, and had, from the first moment, the specific watchful expression of someone paying close attention to his surroundings. Arthur held him for the first time with the care of a man holding something irreplaceable, and looked at Rosa over the baby's head with an expression that needed no words and received none. She simply looked back. James, as he came to be called from almost immediately, grew up in the dustfall with the particular ease of a child, who is loved in a consistent and stable way. He was in the kitchen from the time he could sit on his own, propped on a folded blanket in the corner while Rosa worked, and he developed opinions about food almost as early as language to express them, which Arthur found entirely predictable, and which Rosa pretended not to find deeply gratifying. The Tuesday lessons had expanded by 1886 into something that Rosa was beginning to think of as a small school, 12 regular students now, of varied ages and backgrounds, including 2 women from the Mexican families south of town who spoke primarily Spanish, and with whom Rosa conducted the lessons in a combination of her limited Spanish and their developing English that was awkward and effective, and one of the more meaningful things she did in any given week. She had made a friend, in the deep sense, of Elena Vasquez, Hector's wife, who was sharp and practical and unflinching, and who spoke the truth about what life in the territory was for women of her family's background in a way that Rosa listened to carefully, and with the specific attention she owed to histories she hadn't lived. There were things happening in the territory that were injustices, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. The pressures on Mexican land grants, the treatment of Apache families who were being pushed further and further from the lands they had always moved through, the legal and practical limitations on women's agency that she navigated every day in ways she had become so practiced that she sometimes forgot they were there, until she ran into them fresh. She had a conversation with Arthur about all of this one evening that turned into 3 evenings, and the result was that the dustfall made a policy, formally, as much as a policy in a Western saloon in 1886 could be formal, of serving everyone who came to the door. This was not entirely unremarkable in Calico Creek, which had its own architecture of unspoken rules. There were 2 incidents in the first month, both of which Arthur managed with the quiet authority of a man who knew exactly where he stood in his own establishment and exactly what he was willing to fight about. There were no further incidents after that, which Rosa took as evidence that most people, when given clarity about expectations, met them. In the spring of 1887, the kitchen garden produced its best harvest yet. Rosa had been improving the soil methodically for 4 years, adding compost and ash and the specific knowledge she had accumulated from reading, from Elena's advice, from Consuelo's family methods, and from paying the kind of attention that comes from genuine love of a thing. The result was a garden that was producing, by the standards of the territory, something extraordinary: tomatoes in 6 varieties, 4 kinds of chili pepper, herbs, squash, beans, corn, and in a corner that she had spent 2 years coaxing into being, a row of lavender that was probably the only lavender in Calico Creek and possibly in a 20-mile radius. She had put a jar of lavender on every table in the dining room that summer, which Arthur had looked at for a long moment before saying that it was perfect, and which Consuelo had asked about, so that Rosa had given her 3 cuttings and instructions for planting, and within the year there were lavender plants at 4 homes in Calico Creek, and the smell of it in summer became a thing the town associated with itself. These were small things. She knew they were small things. But she had always believed that small things, done with intention and consistency, were how worlds were built. In September of 1887, Rosa discovered she was expecting again. She told Arthur on a Sunday morning, between the breakfast service and the preparations for the Sunday dinner that was the week's largest, sitting on the high stool in the kitchen with the coffee he had just brought her. He sat down across from her and took her hand. "James is going to have opinions about this," he said. "James has opinions about everything," she said. "He gets that from somewhere." "Both directions, I think," Arthur said, and the smile, the real one, the rare one, was fully present, and she thought, as she often thought, that she would never stop finding that smile exactly as good as the first time she had seen it. Their daughter arrived in March of 1888. Clara Rose Finley, named for Rosa's mother, came into the world at dawn on a Sunday, the big dining day, which Rosa later said the baby had chosen deliberately as a comment on priorities, and was small and dark-haired and extremely vocal about her opinions from within the first hour. James, who was 2.5, examined his sister with the serious concentration of someone assessing a new situation, and then said that she was noisy, which was accurate. Arthur held Clara in the crook of his arm and held James's hand, and looked at Rosa with an expression that was simply undone in the best possible way, every careful layer absent. And she knew she was seeing the exact thing he had been moving toward since he put down the rag and paid attention on the first afternoon. The Dustfall Saloon and Dining Room celebrated its 10th year in 1893, which Rosa marked by writing a proper menu for a special dinner and cooking every dish herself, returning to the kitchen in the way she still did on the occasions that mattered, when she wanted to remember what all of it was made of. Consuelo had become the head cook by that point, a position she had grown into with the kind of confident expertise that Rosa found genuinely moving, and ran the kitchen with the same organized intelligence she had been taught. Billy Marsh had eventually decided that his future was in ranching rather than cooking, which Rosa had identified before he did, and which she had encouraged without sentiment, because people grew in the direction they were actually suited for, and that was always the right outcome. The dining room addition had been expanded again in 1890, and the Dustfall now served 60 at full capacity on a good night, which a good night in Calico Creek was increasingly. The town had grown. 200 had become 400, which was becoming 500, and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway had built a line through 20 miles to the north, which had changed the supply situation entirely, and had allowed Rosa's kitchen access to ingredients she had previously only been able to use in the summer season. She had put roasted duck on the menu the first winter after the railway connection, which had caused Consuelo to stand very still in the kitchen for a moment and then laugh. James was 8 years old and already helping in the kitchen on Saturday mornings, with the focused seriousness of a child who understood that this was a real place doing real work, not a performance for his benefit. He had his father's patience and his mother's precision, and an additional quality of easy warmth that was entirely his own, which made him useful in the dining room in a way that several customers had pointed out, which pleased Rosa, and which she was careful not to praise excessively, because she had strong opinions about the relationship between external validation and intrinsic motivation. Clara was 5 and had her mother's opinions and her father's direct gaze, and absolutely no one's patience, which Rosa thought was probably its own kind of gift. Arthur had aged in the way that some men age well. The gray at his temples that had started appearing at 35 gave his face a gravity that suited it, and the lines around his eyes were the kind that came from spending years looking at things with close and genuine attention. He still ran the bar and the floor with the same quiet authority. He still fixed things himself when things needed fixing, with his box of tools that he maintained with the same care he gave to everything. He had taken on more of the business management as the Dustfall grew, and he was good at it in the way he was good at anything that required patience and careful thinking. He remained the man who paid complete attention. 30 years later, Rosa knew this would still be the first thing she would say about him, the thing that was most essentially him. In the spring of 1893, 10 years after her arrival on the noon stage with her trunk and her satchel and her Winchester, Rosa sat in the kitchen garden on the wooden bench Arthur had built the previous fall, in the early morning before the kitchen was warm, with the coffee she had made, and the specific quiet of the time before the day began. The garden was coming up around her, 10 years of soil improvement showing in the deep green of the early growth, the lavender already beginning to bud at the southern edge. She was thinking about the letter she had received from her brother Thomas 2 weeks prior. He was in Chicago, married, with 2 children of his own now, and the years of correspondence had built back something real between them. Not what they had been before the rupture, but something different and in some ways better, more honestly constructed. He had written to say that he was bringing his family west that summer, to see New Mexico, to see the dust fall, to meet Arthur and the children. He had written, "I think I understand now what you were building. I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." She had read the letter twice. Then she had gone into the bar and found Arthur and given it to him to read, because there were things she did not need to process alone anymore, and that had been true for a decade, and she had not gotten tired of it. He had read it and handed it back and said, "He sounds like he's become someone worth knowing." "He always was," she said. "We both just needed more time." Now she sat in the garden in the spring morning with the coffee and the growing things and the sounds of the building waking up around her, James moving in his room above, Clara's voice starting in the bright particular way it had in the morning, Arthur's boots on the stairs in the specific rhythm she would have recognized anywhere. The door opened behind her. Arthur came out with his own coffee, sat on the bench beside her, and looked at the garden. She looked at him looking at the garden. This had been their morning for years now when the weather allowed it. "Warren Coles is selling the roadhouse," he said. "I heard. He's moving to Arizona territory. Do you want it?" She looked at him. "The roadhouse? The building. It's a good location. If you're serious about the school idea," she had mentioned once the idea of a formal cooking school. A real one with a proper curriculum, not just the Tuesday lessons. A place women from the region could come to learn. She had mentioned it once 7 months ago, and he had not forgotten it. She looked at him with the full weight of everything she had built here, everything she had become, the woman she had been becoming since before she arrived and had continued becoming in ways she hadn't foreseen, all of it in her eyes, and he looked back with his particular attention, completely present as he always was, as he had been from the moment he put down the rag. "Yes," she said. "I want it." He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was decided. "I'll talk to Carmichael. I'll want to design the interior. I know. I'll need more shelving than you think is reasonable. I've come to consider your shelving requirements the floor, not the ceiling," he said, completely straight-faced. She laughed. She felt it come up from the same genuine place it always did, the real laugh, the one that had loosened something in him the first time it appeared and that still did. She could see it in the way his face responded. He put his arm around her in the early morning garden, and she leaned against him, and they sat with the coffee and the growing things and the sounds of their children waking and the particular light of the New Mexico spring, which was nothing like Boston and which had been, for 10 years, the light she thought of when she thought of home. She had arrived with a recipe, a rifle, and an opinion on everything. He had said she was overqualified. He had been wrong about that in the most productive way, and she had been right. And she had proven it with her hands and her work and her presence over 10 years of early mornings and full kitchens, and kitchen gardens and tablecloths, and the Tuesday lessons, and the children and the late evenings with the good whiskey and every conversation they had ever had that had built something real between them, and she would go on proving it for every year left to her. This was not an ending. She understood that. It was just a morning in the garden, which was itself part of the ongoing construction of a life. But she knew the shape of it, sitting here with Arthur Finley's arm around her and the lavender beginning to bud, and the shape was good, and it was hers, and it was built to last. The hawk she had been watching since spring made one more slow circle in the brightening sky above Calico Creek, and Rosa Harper Finley watched it go, and then went in to start the bread.